Okay, we're going to get going here on time because we only have an hour with Kara. So I'm going to start by welcoming everyone. Hi, thank you for joining us. I'm Ellie from DIAG. That's Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender. DIAG is an organization of lifelong Democratic voters working to depoliticize and shed light on the ideologically driven medical scandal and associated harms that have resulted from the adoption of gender ideology. We are building a movement to shift the prevailing narrative around the experimental, dangerous medical practices that comprise sex trait modification, which is euphemistically known as gender affirming care, and to clear a path for a saner, safer, evidence based response to gender distress. Please visit our website at diag.org. That's di-ag.org. Um, DIAG believes in the liberal value of free speech and open discussion, which is part of why we host these spaces. Um, we want to invite discussion on topics that have been left out of the public discourse. So welcome. Thank you for joining us here. Before we start, I'd like to urge those of you who are parents who are raising a child who has adopted a trans identity to head over to the LGBT Courage Coalition Substack and participate in their call to action. This week, NPR affiliate station WBUR will be discussing pediatric gender medicine. And we all know how rare it is that NPR addresses this. And they're asking for the public to call in to let them know whether you've been able to find the information you need to make the right choice in their minds, right choice for your family and for yourself, and what questions you're navigating. So please check out the LGBT Courage Coalition Substack for details and participate in this important action. We'll also post the link in the thread. Okay, I'm going to hand this over to Ellen and we'll get going.
Thank you, DIAG. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Ellen Danick. I'm a DIAG supporter. And with us tonight, we have Kara Dansky, the author of The Reckoning, How the Democrats and the Left Betrayed Women and Girls. She's also the author of The Abolition of Sex, How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls. Kara is currently the president of the U.S. chapter of Women's Declaration International. She has a BA in political science from Johns Hopkins University and a JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Kara has previously served as a public defender, executive director of the Stanford Criminal Justice Center, and senior counsel at the ACLU. Kara Dansky, welcome to the space tonight.
Hi, thank you so much to DIAG for having me.
We are here tonight to talk about your latest book, The Reckoning, How the Democrats and the Left Betrayed Women and Girls. It was published in November, and you've talked about why you wrote it and what you hope happens next. And before we get into the heart of that, can I ask you, Kara Dansky, to read a short passage? Because I think this particular paragraph from the Reckoning really encapsulates what is coming for Democratic Party leaders.
Sure, I'm happy to read the paragraph. To give some context, this paragraph appears in chapter 7, which is called The Accomplices, and it is in the context of how the book is laid out. The entire part 3 is about those who are complicit. And even though I believe the Democratic Party and the major left-leaning, traditionally progressive organizations in the United States are primarily responsible for the abolition of sex, I think that there are some accomplices. And the last section of that chapter concerns, quote, everyone else who went along. So the paragraph I'm being asked to read goes as follows. At some point, and I don't know when, but the day is coming, everyone who has been complicit in abolishing sex are going to have to ask themselves, did I really support the housing of male violent rapists and murderers in prisons with women? Did I really support men being permitted to take medals, honors, and championships from female athletes? Did I really support children being permitted to sterilize themselves and get surgeries that permanently altered their otherwise healthy bodies? Did I deny that sex is real? Did I think that human beings can change sex? Did I really go along with the idea that women who fight for women's sex-based rights were hateful bigots who need to be told to shut the F up and threatened with violence? Did I really participate in the destruction of the very nature of humanity and of material reality itself? Good luck.
Kara, thank you so much for reading that. I think that is such a good way to lead into talking about the reckoning that you predict that is coming or that you hope is coming, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. The premise of this book really resonates with what we're trying to accomplish here at DIAG. Let's start by, if you could talk just for a bit about why you wrote this book and what you want to accomplish with it.
Sure. So I'm a lifelong leftist. I've never not been a leftist. I have been a feminist, an environmentalist. I have leaned toward being more of a socialist than a capitalist. I'm a labor rights supporter and I'm a civil rights supporter and everything that goes along with being a leftist. My career was in criminal justice until I essentially turfed myself out of it um, several years ago. We could talk about that if you'd like. But even though I didn't have a professional career in feminism, I've always considered myself a feminist. And so when I understood what was happening here with quote unquote gender identity and its assault on material reality and on women and girls as a sex class, I pulled all my old radical feminist texts down from my bookshelf and I reacquainted myself and I said, okay, now's the time to get involved. And I joined the group, the Women's Liberation Front, and I served on its board for 4 years. And as you said, I'm now the president of WDI USA. I have to say, I am here tonight solely in my personal capacity, not in my capacity as president of WDI USA. But in early 2021, a publisher contacted me and he'd heard about me and he was really interested in this idea that there is a leftist feminist critique of so-called gender identity, and he invited me to write a book about it, and we had a few phone conversations back and forth, and that book became The Abolition of Sex, which was published in November 2021. And he indicated at the time that perhaps we might have a future conversation about another book. And then we spoke at the end of 2022 and he said he was interested in potentially publishing another book and he wanted to know what was on my mind. And at the time, I just hadn't even really formulated a pitch. I didn't have a pitch at all. I just was on the phone with him and I just said, okay, at this point, at the end of 2022, we know that the American electorate is opposed to men and women's sports. We know that the American electorate is opposed to harming children with puberty blockers and wrong sex hormones. We know that the American electorate is not okay with men in women's prisons or with men in women's spaces. So I'm concerned that Democratic Party leadership is going to slowly walk back its support for enshrining so-called gender identity in the law. Now, I turn out to have been completely wrong about that, judging from recent developments with the Biden administration. But nonetheless, that was my thinking in 2022. I was worried that the Democratic Party leadership was going to try to quietly walk it back, and I didn't want them to be able to do that because too many women have been raped in prison. Too many girls and women have lost their awards and scholarships in sports. Too many children have been harmed at the altar of so-called gender identity. And I don't want the Democrats in power to be able to get away with it. So I wrote the book thinking that I wanted Democrats to come clean and hold themselves accountable. And that's what I end up doing in the afterword. Um, I I don't particularly want the Democrats to face a reckoning at the ballot box. I don't, especially given the likely uh, candidate for president on the Republican side in 2024. But what I really want is for Democrats to hold themselves accountable and to hold themselves accountable to women and girls. And I want them to earn the votes of women and girls. They have lost our trust. They have lost our confidence. So I'm not particularly interested in them losing at the ballot box, but I'm pretty sure that's what's going to happen. And it will be their own fault, to clarify. It will absolutely be their own fault.
Kara, that is so interesting because that really does resonate, as you know, with what we're trying to do here at DIAG. We want the Democrats to hold themselves accountable. We want them to come back to being the party of open and reasonable discussion and science and all of the values that we've traditionally associated with our party and with our side of the debate. So it's really interesting to hear you make that point, that you're not looking for a reckoning at the ballot box. You want the Democrats to hold themselves accountable.
Yeah, the afterword to the book, it seems odd to be talking about the afterword at the beginning of the conversation, but the afterword begins with a cautionary tale and goes into a policy prescription. And the cautionary tale is to say, listen, Democrats in power, women are leaving their left leaning parties all over the world. Take a look across the pond. Have a look at the Labour Party. Have a look at the Greens across the pond. Have a look at Labour and the Greens in Australia and New Zealand. Women are leaving in droves. And the exact same thing is going to happen to the Democrats if they don't change course.
The challenge is, how do you get them to believe that?
Right. And so we're in this really difficult position in 2024, which I would argue is even more difficult than we were in. And by we, I mean female Democrats who care about women and girls as a sex class. It's even harder now than it was in 2020, because many of us who follow this issue have known just how bad, quote unquote, gender identity is for women and girls for a long time. I think many of us did not quite anticipate just how viciously and ferociously President Biden would assault women and girls with it, beginning in day one with his administration. So we're in a really difficult position. But I think a couple of things. I think that there are Democrats at the state level who are voting consistent with the sex-based rights of women and girls and voting to protect kids. They're few and far between, but they exist. And the more Democrats at the state level who are willing to speak up and take that position, the more cover they give other Democrats to do the same thing. In early 2022, WDIUSA sent my book, The Abolition of Sex, to every single member of Congress who was in office at the time. We're working on sending The Reckoning to every single member of Congress as we speak. And the Democrats just have to be told that if they don't hold themselves accountable, something's going to happen. There's a dynamic I'd like to tease out, and I don't know if now is the right time for it, but I think there are some differences between the administration and congressional Democrats that are worth talking about.
I think now's the perfect time, especially because you've already alluded to, what the executive branch has been doing both at the beginning of the Biden administration and then as recently as the gutting of Title IX. And I think it'd be really interesting to talk about how that compares with what's going on in Congress. So let's talk about that. When you think about what's possible at the federal level, how do you think about that differently with the congressional body versus the executive branch?
So Congress is interesting. First, I should say I have approximately zero hope that the Biden administration is going to walk back anything between now and November. I just don't see it happening. With Congress, however, there are some nuances that are worth noticing, which two of which are as follows. The Department of Education issued its proposed Title IX changes way back in the summer of 2022. That's when the department said, well, in early 2021, the Department of Education and the Department of Justice both issued memos or guidance letters to tell schools to redefine sex to mean gender identity for all Title IX purposes. A federal court eventually ruled that those letters were procedurally flawed. In other words, the administration had failed to comply with the applicable rules regarding notice and opportunity for public comment. So that's essentially what the Biden administration tried to fix in the summer of 2022 when they put out their proposed Title IX rule changes. They did that lawfully. They put it out. They gave the public notice. They gave the public an opportunity for comment, which is what they're required to do. And they got pummeled with public comments. They got over 250,000 public comments within the 3-month, or I think it was 3-month comment period. Comments closed September 12th, 2022. 250,000 comments is the most in department history. And on the very last day of public comment, September 12th, 2022, Senate Democrats put out a letter supporting the department's proposed amendments to Title IX to redefine sex to include gender identity for all Title IX purposes. So, as many of us know, in today's political climate, there's nothing unusual about Senate Democrats supporting the Department of Education's proposed changes to redefine sex to include gender identity. But here's what's interesting: a total of 19 Senate Democrats signed that letter. That's fewer than half of Senate Democrats, which means that more than half of Senate Democrats were unwilling to sign a letter supporting the department's proposed amendments. That's interesting. I'm not in the minds of the senators, the Senate Democrats who did not sign that letter, so I don't know what their thinking was, but I do know they didn't sign it. And I know it because I looked at the letter and I counted the names, and there were a total of 19 of them. Fast forward to November 2023, the department was lagging behind in finalizing the proposed amendments. They were supposed to have done it way back in early 2023. They missed their deadline. Then they were supposed to do it in October of 2023. Then they missed their deadline. I'm fairly convinced that the department knows how deeply unpopular this is with the American electorate. But in any event, in November 2023, House Democrats put out a published statement urging the department to go forward and push through the final regulations redefining sex to include gender identity. Again, in today's political climate, there's nothing surprising about Democrats in power supporting the Department of Education in redefining sex to include so-called gender identity. But the number of House Democrats who signed that letter was 64. That's fewer than a quarter of House Democrats were willing to put their name on a statement urging the Department of Education to push through amendments redefining sex to include gender identity under Title IX. So that's interesting. A clear majority of congressional Democrats in both chambers has been unwilling to put their names on public statements supporting the department. I don't want to read too much into that, but still, it's interesting. And it suggests that there are some complicated dynamics going on behind the scenes in the US Capitol.
Well, and you may not be able to put yourself in the mind of those senators and Congress members, but as you just said, the numbers are the numbers, and you could certainly make an educated guess. You described it as interesting. Would you go so far as to say it might be hopeful, or is that too strong a word?
Well, I think it's hopeful, but I tend to be unhelpfully and naively optimistic. I will reach for anything that suggests even a sliver of hope. So I honestly, it's very difficult to know what to read into it. But I do think it's really interesting. There's some other dynamics going on. So, for example, there's a bill called the Equality Act, which many people are probably familiar with, initially introduced in 2015. The Equality Act would be much worse than anything the Biden administration could even do. What the Biden administration has done is terrible, absolutely terrible. But what Congress can do is much, much, much worse. The Equality Act would redefine the word sex to include so called gender identity for literally every purpose under the United States Civil Rights Act. That would mean the end of women only spaces in places of public accommodation all over the country. And Congress has had the opportunity to pass this every year since 2015, and it hasn't done it. The House of Representatives passed it once in 2019. The House passed it again in 2021, at which point it went to the Senate and was referred to the Senate Judiciary Committee. In March of 2021, the Senate Judiciary Committee passed it. Now, I need to pause for a minute just to plug the work of WDI USA and say that when the bill went to the United States Senate, WDI USA sent a letter to the Senate Majority Leader, Charles Schumer, and it was signed by thousands of women all over the world, thanks to the global organizing efforts of Women's Declaration International. Thousands of women all over the world said, Majority Leader Schumer, do not do this. And when I say WDI USA sent that to Majority Leader Schumer, I don't mean that we put it in a contact form and hit send and sent it into the ether. What I mean by that is that a woman with WDI USA lives in New York, and Majority Leader Schumer is her senator, and she was able to secure a meeting with Senate staff. And we had a few meetings with one of the staffers and had her personal, not her personal, but her individual email address at the Capitol. And we ended up sending that letter not only to his public email address and not only through the website, but also to that key staffer's email address. And she wrote back and she said she had received it and she would ensure her boss signed it. I'm sorry, ensure her boss saw it. Now, I cannot prove that she sent it to Majority Leader Schumer, but she said she would. Also, at around that time, the day before the Senate Judiciary Committee was set to vote on the bill, I sent in my name testimony to every single member of the Senate Judiciary Committee explaining why we oppose the Equality Act. One, men aren't women no matter what they say. Two, sex is real and we have to have a national conversation before enacting such a hideous piece of legislation. And three, children are being harmed. Those were the three main arguments. I'm obviously paraphrasing. But I got email confirmation that every single member of the Senate Judiciary Committee received that testimony. The Senate Judiciary Committee proceeded to pass the bill. And at that point, as far as I know, this is March of 2021, Senate Majority Leader Schumer had the authority to send the bill to the full Senate floor for a vote at any point, and he didn't. So that's significant because when he was campaigning for the presidency, Biden promised to get the bill passed within 100 days of taking office. Not only did he not get the bill passed within 100 days of taking office, he didn't get the bill passed within the first year of taking office, nor did he get the bill passed within the second year of taking office. 2021 and 2022 came and went, and Schumer didn't move at all on the bill, despite having full authority to bring it to the Senate floor for a vote. And if the Senate had voted for it, it would have gone to the president's desk and he surely would have signed it. The bill appeared to be dead at the end of 2022, but a handful of Democrats reintroduced it early this year. But it was only a tiny handful of Democrats who reintroduced it, and it's just sitting there. It hasn't moved at all. It's gotten no action. It's gotten very little attention. And Senate Majority Leader Schumer himself has said nothing in support of the bill since it was reintroduced earlier this year. I'm sorry, that was very long, but I just wanted to add that little bit about the Equality Act as additional evidence that there's something very interesting going on behind the scenes at the US Capitol, suggesting that congressional Democrats are not nearly as on board with the Biden administration's agenda as it might seem publicly.
That's actually really interesting because it also makes me wonder how much of a role timing plays in this. So not just the difference between how on board the congressional Democrats and the Senate Democrats are versus the Biden administration with this ideology and getting it further ensconced in law and policy, but also the timing of as more rank and file Democrats become aware of gender ideology and the harms that it brings, if the folks who are talking to their constituents in elected office in the congressional side of the government are becoming aware that the more Democrats that know about this, the less popular it becomes. Do you think that the timing could be part of that as well?
Sure. And that also goes to the importance of continuing to speak to your elected officials. I know that those of us who have been involved in this for years are very, very tired of banging on the doors of our elected officials and demanding that they listen to us because it is demoralizing to be ignored over and over and over again. It is especially demoralizing when those of us who support same sex attracted rights write to our elected officials and we get letters back from the Democrats in office who say, I support the LGBTQ plus community. It's so frustrating because those of us on this side of the aisle want to scream back, I support lesbian, gay, and bisexual rights. Please knock it off with the TQIA plus. And they're not listening to us. And I know it's really disheartening. I know it's really demoralizing, but I don't know, Ellen, but if you're right and the timing has something to do with it, it might very well be making a difference.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because one thing that I know you're here tonight representing yourself, not WDI USA, but I know that in your capacity with WDI USA, you all did some polling last year on this topic, looking at opinions on gender identity ideology in a variety of applications across the political spectrum. I think now might be an interesting time to talk about some of what you found and how you think that ties into the timing of where we are now, if you're willing to do that.
Sure. WDI USA conducted polling last fall, and the results, quite frankly, were not surprising. Across the political spectrum, 4 out of 5 American voters agree with the statement that the word women means adult humans who are female. A clear 84% of American voters across the political spectrum agree that women's sports should be female only. A clear majority of American voters across the political spectrum agree that men should not be in women's spaces like bathrooms and locker rooms. And and when I say a clear majority, the questions around sports and women's spaces poll at around 84 to 85% of voters across the political spectrum, including voters who call themselves liberal and very liberal, agree with our positions on these topics. And similar majorities appear when it comes to questions about protecting children from puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. So the American electorate is really with us here. And yeah, we could talk about why Democratic Party leadership is ignoring us if you'd like, but those are the results of the polling that WDI USA did last fall.
I have to think, even if, for example, members of Congress and the Senate Democrat, caucus, even if they're not aware of the specific polling information, 85% is not just a clear majority. I mean, that's almost a shutout. You have to think those opinions are at least somewhat being reflected in what they're hearing from their constituency. So I think that's hopeful. To me, that sounds hopeful.
I mean, I hope you're right. I hope that people like us continue to make noise, and I hope that our representatives in Congress are actually listening, regardless of what they have to say in public.
Yeah. One of the things, Kara, that you said that you made clear to these representatives is that men who claim to be women are in fact men. And I think that gets at one of the topics that you raise in the reckoning, if it's okay for me to move on to this topic. It's related but different, which is the role of language and how we talk about this topic to elected officials, particularly Democrat elected officials, can help frame how they understand not just how important it is, but the fact that as Democrats, we're not buying it. I'd like to just talk to you a little bit about how you approach language and why you think that's important and how you communicate with elected officials, particularly on the left.
Yeah, I think language is incredibly important just because it makes the issue so clear. So, for example, if I say, and I'm going to use language that I would never use typically, but I'm doing it to make a point. If I say transgender athletes do not belong in women's sports, then it's very easy to paint me as, quote, anti-trans, right? Because that's the way I framed the statement. But if I
It
say,
is.
what?
I was just agreeing with you. It is. Then it's easy to call you a bigot.
Yeah, completely. But it's very difficult to to disagree with the statement men do not belong in women's sports. And I just think it's critically important to make the point that we're not talking about a subcategory of women here. Because if we were, then it would be discriminatory. But we're not. We're talking about men. And I have just found over the years, this the debate rages on the so-called gender critical side of things. I don't call myself gender critical, but you know what I mean. Should we use the language in order to be nice? And that's not even the question as far as I'm concerned. the question, as far as I'm concerned, is what is going to persuade? I'm interested in winning, and in order to do that, it's important to persuade ordinary people that this really is a very clear-cut, uncomplicated topic, at least when it comes to men and women's sports and spaces. I understand that the issue of uh, children being confused about their sex becomes a little bit more complicated. But at least when we're talking about the issue of women's sports and spaces, it's really not complicated. And just cutting through the nonsense can bring so much light and air to the conversation. And then you can just have a candid conversation. And then, there's no one better to talk with a Democratic elected official than a rank and file Democrat who's on our side of this topic. Conservatives can't do it. So, for example, I have been in rooms with lawmakers where I have said things like, "Thank you so much for your support for abortion rights. I completely agree with you on abortion. And so I'd like to ask you the question, if you support a woman's right to choose abortion, which you do you also support a woman's right to choose not to compete against a man?" They become very confused by questions like that. But it's important to just get those questions out there. Make them defend their position of allowing men and women's sports. When it comes down to it, they have a very hard time doing so.
Oh, I can picture a fair amount of uncertainty and even a little squirming in that scenario, Kara, for sure.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
with one in particular, I'm thinking of a Democrat lawmaker in Pennsylvania, and we were talking about the sports issue. Pennsylvania was debating its sports bill, and her argument drifted into the reason she was opposing the Save Women's Sports bill. She gave as an argument, well, girls and boys often play together at young ages. And I politely interrupted her and I said, "May I ask a clarifying question?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "What do you mean by girls and boys?" And she had absolutely no idea what to do with that.
I can imagine that. And Kara, the example that that story you just shared also highlights a related topic where language is concerned, which is for some of the legislators who maybe haven't thought about this, even at that level of depth, which I'm not saying that the individual you're describing had thought about this particularly deeply, but who really may have just more of a passing acquaintanceship with it, they can get very caught up in the language. When you say trans woman, a lot of them may very well think you're talking about a biological woman. I hate to use that wording, but I'm going to use it to make my point here. A natal woman, a woman who produces large gametes, who is claiming to be a man when they hear trans woman, and when they hear trans man, they may think that they're talking about a man who identifies as a woman. And so there's a level of confusion that you're not even talking about the same topic when you use that language. I think I'm betting you've come across that as well.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah, and the other thing that I've known, and obviously I don't have any experience with talking to federal officials the way you do, but here I live in Colorado, as you know, and with talking to state officials here, one thing I've noticed is if an elected official, a Democrat, is spending all their time trying to figure out how can I use the right language not to offend anyone, it's really hard for them to follow the substance of the discussion because they're spending a lot of time policing their own language. It's like their brain is 30 or 40% occupied with just that.
It reminds me a little bit of the 2020 Democratic presidential primary when candidate Julian Castro said that one of his main platforms was going to be securing abortion rights for transgender women. Now,
There you go.
if you support quote unquote trans, you're at least supposed to know what you mean by the word transgender woman. And he clearly did not, and he really embarrassed himself.
That's a place where he embarrassed himself with people who come down on either side of this particular topic.
Right.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Um, yeah, I think the role of language and talk the clarity that it brings is important. And I've heard you say in another interview um, that there's something to be said for liberating ourselves as rank and file Democrats to use correct language and to tell other rank and file Democrats it's okay to use reality based language.
Yeah, I mean, we are at the point now, I'm quite certain we are at the point now that most Americans don't need to be told that, or don't need to be persuaded that the emperor has no clothes. The vast majority of the American electorate understands that the emperor has no clothes. There's always going to be the loudest and most obnoxious, activists on the other side who are going to insist trans women are women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But most Americans across the political spectrum understand that the emperor is not wearing any clothes. Our job now is to reach those Americans who already know that the emperor is naked and persuade them that it's okay to just say so right out loud.
Yes. I just want to put my hands in the air and say yes. Do you ever encounter when you're talking to elected officials and you use correct language, do you ever encounter them recoiling from the rest of your message because they are put off by the fact that you are using reality based language, or is it more often helpful?
Well, if you're talking with completely committed Democrats and their staffs, they're just going to block you out. I mean,
Regardless of what language you use, that's true.
yeah, yeah. Um, but they're not all there. I was speaking with, back to Pennsylvania, not a lawmaker herself, but a senator's staffer who was a man, and we were having what I thought was a pretty authentic conversation. And I knew because our team, the WDIUSA State Legislative Advocacy Team, had done some homework and learned that this particular state senator served on her state's Women's Health Commission. And at one point, when I was talking with her staffer, I said, I understand your boss serves on the Women's Health Commission. That has to mean something. The words women's health have to mean something. And I could tell I got through to him. I could tell that he could understand quite clearly that that makes sense.
Oh, that's interesting. Hmm. Well, if I move on a little bit to other things you wrote about in the Reckoning that I think are specifically applicable to what we're trying to accomplish at Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender. One thing that I thought would be interesting to discuss is for people who are on the left, like liberals and people farther to the left, do you have any thoughts on how we can work most effectively within coalitions while still staying true to our principles? Like, for example, you told that story about the conversation about abortion rights. Have you have you got any advice or recommendations about how to reconcile the tension that seems to come out because of forced teaming on policy issues, in especially at the state level? How to reconcile the tension between being able to support something like abortion rights and also insisting on biological reality and the protections that provides for women and children and speech. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm fully understanding your question, but I don't have any tension with that, right? I have only always ever been completely supportive of abortion rights. I'm probably further in my support for abortion rights than most Democrats. Um, and that's never going to change. And it's just apparent to me that the only people who need abortions are women and occasionally teenage girls who become pregnant. And so it's no less important to stand up for women and girls as a sex class. So I don't experience that tension at all. Is there tension sometimes working with conservative groups who are explicitly anti-abortion? Sure, that tension exists. I've been doing this for several years, and I have made common cause with some individuals and groups who are staunchly anti-abortion, and it works because we don't really try to convince each other. You know, they don't try to convince me that abortion is murder because they know that that would be absolutely futile and a complete waste of everyone's time. But if we can pool resources as women, and one other thing I will say is that some conservative women in this country, even though we don't share many of the same political opinions at all, a lot of conservative women want things that progressive women want too. They want jobs, you know, they want to be able to work outside the home frequently, not always, but frequently. They want to be able to have more autonomy from their husbands. They want to be able to have leadership positions. So to a certain extent there's some natural overlap, and we can just avoid discussion about topics we know we disagree about.
Yep, that makes sense. I was actually thinking, and I wasn't as clear as I'd like to be, I was actually thinking about in terms of engaging on specific laws, and this is more at the state level than at the federal level, but often protection of abortion rights in blue states gets like spliced together in the law with things like creating sanctuary states for sex trait modification surgery or drugs for minors. And so when you think about, as Democrats, how can we weigh in on the part of that bill that's harmful to women and girls as a sex class, as well as to children, but weigh in on the abortion aspect, which we might support. I know you have some experience specifically with WDI taking positions on bills. And again, I know you're not here representing them tonight, but that was the tension I was thinking about. I don't know if that prompts any additional commentary from you.
I understand. Yes, thanks for clarifying. I totally get the issue now. In my view, force teaming those two issues in legislation is one of the most disgusting and cynical things that Democrat leaders have done in my lifetime. I just find it absolutely appalling. And so what Democrats will do is introduce a bill that will either protect or expand or preserve abortion rights, and they'll talk about that very loudly and champion it, and that's great. But what they won't say is that hidden within the bill is a poison pill that's designed to sterilize children. I mean, I don't know another way to say it. It's just
Yep.
awful, and I'm so appalled at the legislators who do this. The first incidents I heard of this happening was actually not a legislative bill. It was a initiative in the state of Michigan. It went right to the voters. I believe it was in 2020. It may have been 2022. It went straight to the voters, and it was billed as an abortion rights proposal. It must have been 2022 because we knew that Roe was being overturned at that point. And so countless Michigan women flocked to vote yes on that bill. And for good reason, right? Because they were there to protect abortion rights in Michigan. And I'm absolutely convinced that hardly any of them knew what was in that bill in terms of what it would do to kids. So what to do
Yeah.
about that? I mean, the only thing I can think to do about it is just to keep talking about it. As you say, I'm not here to represent WDI USA, but I can say that WDI USA's state legislative advocacy team has agonized over what to do about this. And what it's done is submit testimony, neither supporting nor opposing the bill, and explaining why, explaining our steadfast support for abortion rights under Article 3 of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, and our ardent opposition to measures that would harm children, consistent with Article 9 of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights.
Thank you, Kara. And full disclosure, I am a signatory to the WDI, the International Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, and it's helpful to hear you talk about that. Again, I'm not here representing WDI either. One more thing, and then maybe we'll keep the last 10 minutes of the hour for questions because we've covered a lot of ground. But if the reckoning succeeds in one of the things that the book sets out to do, and you're very explicit about this, which is a record of what our Democratic leaders have done in the name of gender ideology and the harm that's caused, if it keeps them from memory holing that, do you think that we will ever have our own version of the Nuremberg trials for gender? And would we even want to?
It's a good question. It might depend on which aspects. I certainly know people who want some version of the Nuremberg trials for doctors who participated in the harming of children's bodies. Um, that certainly makes sense to me. I don't know if I agree with it. I want to give it some more thought. I think that it would be much more difficult to think through the process for doing it around topics around women's sports and spaces. Prison is a little bit easier. I don't think I would have any trouble trying anyone, Scott Wiener, Gavin Newsom,
Can
responsible.
picture a whole rogues gallery of men of political officials, Democratic officials who've caused real harm on the women's prison topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, you know, we live in a really big country with a lot of different states and localities. Um, Washington, D.C., where I live, prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender identity in places of public accommodation. And I have walked into a women's bathroom and encountered a man wearing a dress with long blonde hair and pink nail polish. Uh, I happen to know the owner, and the owner and I spoke about it, and he was like, "There's nothing I can do under applicable DC law." And I was like, "Dude, I know, I get it. Like, I know DC law. I understand." I would not be in favor of prosecuting that particular restaurant owner. He didn't want that man in the women's bathroom any more than I did. But he was bound by the law in place in the district. And I'm not going to hold him too responsible for it. So I just think it raises a lot of very complicated questions.
Yep, that's a nuanced answer. Thank you so much. Well, before I get to wrapping up with you and opening this up to just a couple of questions, because we'll only have about 10 minutes for that, and I'll ask Ellie from DIAG to start moving people onto the speaker stage who have questions. So if you're interested, request to be a speaker, and you'll get moved up to be a speaker and just stay muted until we call on you. You can put your hand up, just kind of standard rules and guidelines about how we do things in a space. We're here for open discussion, but we're looking for people to ask questions, not share a manifesto on the stage,
Just
and for everybody to be polite.
just real quick before we go on to that, let me just also add, I'm not trying to be an apologist for business owners who allow men to access women's spaces. I just want to give an example. This is not hypothetical. A couple of years ago, a man named Charles Clymer, who goes by the name of Charlotte, did try to access the women's bathroom in a popular restaurant in DC, and security staff kicked him out. To their great credit, and he turned around and sued the restaurant before the DC Human Rights Commission, and he won. And then that restaurant had to hand over, I want to say it was $700,000, not to the man, but to the city. That's real. That's really real. The restaurant did the right thing by trying to keep Clymer out of the women's bathroom. And because of the applicable law, it ended up having to pay $700,000. So these aren't hypothetical scenarios we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a thank you for clarifying that. And I don't think you're trying to be an apologist for business owners. I mean, business owners have to follow the law. That's one of the most basic things we do as individual citizens as well as businesses. And I can see other implications of that under the law. I know that things are different in DC, but here in Colorado, I've talked to some women who are concerned about if they ever got into an altercation with, let's say, a man who attacked them in the bathroom and they had a concealed carry permit and they felt like their life was in danger and they drew their weapon. Would they be the one going to jail because someone could credibly make an argument that they were being discriminatory or bigoted or not following the law and that they shouldn't have perceived a threat?
Right. The argument would be that she was the aggressor because that poor, vulnerable trans woman had the right to be in the bathroom in accordance with, quote unquote, her gender identity.
Yes, exactly, which comes back to the importance of language.
Yep.
It's amazing how things come full circle. I think we're just going to move on to wrapping up because kind of surprisingly, we don't have anyone asking to be a speaker or ask a question. So, Kara, we've covered a lot of ground. if you were going to give, because the group that we have here tonight, these are people on the left who think that gender ideology is harmful, and we want the Democrats to come back to being the party of reality. If you were going to give us any last pieces of advice, what would that be?
So I want to say at the outset that I understand that a lot of people cannot take the kinds of risks that I have taken. I do not have children. I do not have a mortgage to pay. I do not have a car payment. So I've done what I've done. I've just thrown myself out there, and I understand that other people are in different circumstances and may not feel like they can take the risks that I've chosen to take. I totally get that. I do want to say, if you choose to speak out, and I don't even necessarily mean in a loud way. I just mean like talking to people you know. Now is actually a really good time to do it. I have had some surprisingly refreshing, open conversations with people in my personal life recently that I would not have been able to have 2 years ago. Literally yesterday, I had reason to be reacquainted with an old friend, who I haven't spoken to probably in 15 years, for reasons having nothing to do with this. But we ended up connecting for various reasons, and we were texting each other to find a time to talk. And she kind of knew what I was working on, but she wasn't really clear. And she texted me sort of a vaguely turfy message to say, "What are you working on these days? I think I saw that you were working with a group that was women, only women." And, I could sort of tell she was kind of tiptoeing into it. And rather than beat around the bush about it, I just responded and I said, "Yep, I'm a turf." And she wrote back, "Yep, me too." And we got on the phone yesterday and we had a very refreshing conversation.
I love that. Turf
Things,
cuts right to the heart of it.
I didn't even explain what it meant. She knew immediately what it meant. So I know these things are really hard. I know that many of us, including myself, have people in our own lives who are caught up in the delusion that they are the opposite sex or possibly a third sex that doesn't exist. I know it's really hard. I really, really do know how hard it is. But things are changing really quickly. Um, and since this is, I assume, mostly an American audience, I will say, come on, let's catch up with Turf Island. Of course,
Woohoo!
of course, we all are in awe of Turf Island, but come on, we can't let them win.
I love that, Kara. That's awesome. We do have one person with a question. Kara, is it okay if I bring her on and ask her to ask you her question?
Sure.
Okay, great. And then we will wrap up. Bridget, you can unmute and ask Kara Dansky your question. I'm happy to see you here.
Thank you, Ellen. Hi, Kara. So we all know this is an election year. We already know, or believe we know, who's going to be running for president at this point. And I'm really, really at a place where I understand I'm going to have to decide, and I have already decided, but I'm suspecting many people here are struggling with this, what we do come November. And while I believe voting is personal, I'm asking on a larger scale. When you talk about the reckoning, Kara, I think part of this has to be, what do we ask individual people to do? Because I know that I can't support women totally with any candidate. Half the candidates will not make abortion a reality, and I'm not sure that they can, even the ones who say they can. And the other candidates really no longer want to acknowledge what a woman is. So my question is, with us in the middle of a hot political season, and I don't think being given good choices, what do what how I mean, my most effective thing was to go and register as an independent so that I can split my ticket between the legislative branch and the executive branch. So what else would you suggest? I mean, I'm just saying, how do we bring this reckoning at the same time we don't hurt women further?
No, it's true. We are in an absolutely impossible situation. The only suggestion I have is that for anyone who can, if you have time, go go to town halls, whether they're and I'm not I don't want to address the presidential election because I don't have anything I don't have anything at all good to say about either of those men. Um, but in other elections, right? Down ballot elections, go to town halls. Like this is so serious and it's an existential crisis. And if your candidates for office, especially on the Democrat side, but even on the Republican side if you want, um, just stand up and ask the question. Stand up and ask, will you protect women and girls as a sex class? And see what they say. You might be surprised. Now, one of the women who serves on the board of WDIUSA recently did that at a virtual town hall for one of her candidates, and her question just went ignored. It was virtual, and so she put it in chat, and the organizers just ignored it. And I made that an episode of my Substack series, FFS Friday. Her name's Lorraine Nolan. But if you can do it in person, that's even better. Get up, get the mic. These are our elected officials. They are supposed to be answerable to us. It doesn't matter what party, it doesn't matter if they're the same party you are, if they're the other party you are. But if you can get the bravery to go in there, go into a room and say, in a room full of people, will you support women and girls as a sex class? Will you fight to keep men out of women's sports? Even asking those questions brings some light and air and space to the issue. Even saying it out loud helps. It really does. I've had that experience. Just saying it out loud helps. And if you can ask the question, someone else is going to ask the question.
That is such great advice, Kara. Bridget, thanks for your question. I think we're gonna wrap it up there. So you mentioned, I'd just like to tell people, Kara, where to find you and where to find out more about you. You mentioned your Substack. Can you talk about how people can find that?
Sure. If you go to Kara Dansky Substack, I try to post as many free and shareable posts as I possibly can. I did one today that was essentially a repost of a parents with inconvenient truths about trans posts about emailing the American Academy of Pediatrics. And then I do once or twice a week a post for paid only subscribers where I go into much more depth and detail about the movement to protect the sex-based rights of women and girls and to stop the abolition of sex. I mostly focus on the legal and legislative aspects, and I mostly focus on the United States, but every once in a while, I'll do a deep dive into a different aspect of the movement, and sometimes I'll talk about other countries.
That's great. And you also mentioned your FFS series. Do you want to just briefly talk about that? Because I really love that.
So, a woman that Ellen works with in Colorado, Christina Goecki, testified against a bill called Tierra's Law, which is named after a man named Dwayne who wants to be able to change his name. Dwayne is a convicted felon, a sex offender, and he would like to be able to change his name. That law eventually passed and was signed. But Christina testified against it, and she did an unbelievably amazing job in her testimony. She was so straightforward. The chairwoman tried to silence her with her gavel, and Christina just made it unbelievably clear that she was going to speak, she was going to exercise her free speech rights, and she was not going to compromise on language. And I was so inspired by Christina. I started a new series on Substack. It comes out every Friday called Female Free Speech Friday, FFS Friday. And no, it is not a coincidence that FFS stands for something else as well.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Kara. I could talk to you for the next 5 hours. This is just so interesting. And thanks for the good guidance on what we can do as rank and file Democrats. I really appreciate it. Ellie from DIAG, anything you want to say to wrap things up before we close out for tonight?
Yeah, no. I mean, yeah, we could have talked another 2 hours easily. There's so much in the book. I highly encourage. I mean, it will upset you to read the book, but I highly encourage people to read The Reckoning. It feels like the record that we need of who's accountable for what, and what the state of reality here is in the U.S. So highly recommend that you read the book. And I want to thank Kara. Always a pleasure to have you with us here. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks so much to DIAG for having me. Thanks for having the conversation. And thanks for everyone for coming.
Bye, everybody. Thanks and good night.